My name is Andrew Skinner, and I am one of the participants in the film that you're about to see. The film is about the work of Latter-day Saints during World War I. Immediately following World War I, the world was engulfed in a worldwide pandemic similar to the pandemic that we're now experiencing. And yet, from those two devastating events comes the ultimate message of hope, that there are reasons to believe in a better future. My father, Charles Skinner, was a participant in World War I. I was born later in his life. I recently came in possession of a cablegram addressed to my father's mother, July 21st, 1918, indicating that my father was missing in action. I can't imagine how that affected my grandmother to receive a telegram saying that her son was lost in action. And I hope one of the things that you will take from the movie that you're about to see is that even in the darkest of times, even in those hours which seem the most bleak, there is always reason for hope. The circumstances that we're in now have also been experienced by those who have gone before. And it's because of their fortitude and their resilience and their hope that we can look forward in our own lives to a bright future. We can cultivate genuine hope that things will get better and cultivate a belief and an understanding we will yet live in times that are filled with happiness and peace as a result of what we've seen before in history. Obviously, my father did survive. Though he was wounded, he survived World War I. He survived the global pandemic, and as a result of that, I'm here and have enjoyed a wonderful and a rich life. And I hope that ultimately that you will take away from this film that there is always reason for hope and that things will turn out for our best good as they did in the case of my father.
Today in the 21st century, we are greatly benefited by a multitude of things that had roots a century ago in the era of World War I. Innovations, institutions, but especially people who put their lives on the line to preserve freedoms we have now.
My own father actually fought in World War I.
My grandfather served in World War I.
An ancestor of mine named Charles Flake.
My grandfather served in the 91st Division. Joseph F. Smith had 6 sons that he sent off to war in World War I.
In my own family, my grandfather was one of the soldiers.
He chose my grandfather, Calvin, to be one of 3 chaplains.
When things got tough, you kind of thought about Grandpa Humphrey. He was in World War I.
I would hope that my grandchildren would not see themselves as part of this fast-paced, disposable generation that experiences come and go. But our experiences are here to mean something. We are sent to earth by our Father in heaven to have a strong mortal experience, and we learn from the experiences of others. The armistice that ended World War I was signed at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1918.
If there's ever a war that should not have occurred, it was World War I. It is an absolute failure of politics, diplomacy, and statesmanship. What's interesting in the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophia is the weapon used was a Browning semi-automatic pistol. So John Moses Browning from Ogden, Utah, designed this weapon, or the type of weapon used in the assassination.
When the war started, the game of alliances brought the different nations to war. On one side, of course, you had the Triple Alliance with Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also Italy. And then the Triple Entente, as we call it in French, which meant France, the British Empire, and also Russia. This war started with the soldiers thinking that it would not last very long. They left, as we say, with the fleur au fusil, the flower on their rifles, thinking that they would be back after a few weeks only.
It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go.
It was a celebratory atmosphere when they departed. They assured their parents and others, well, they'd be home in time for Christmas of 1914, that the war would soon be over. Well, of course, that was not to happen.
So the fighting war started in August of 1914. When Germany invaded France, 7 field armies going through Belgium and Holland and France to attack.
And the war began to be this protracted, long, paralyzing conflict fought in the trenches.
Each combatant thought that if we go to war, we'll be able to do a knockout punch in 6 weeks. I don't know where the figure 6 weeks came from, but it's in virtually all of the histories, and all of the combatants seemed to think that it would be a very quick little war that would give them what they wanted. They had no idea what was coming. It was a catastrophe unheralded in human history, and it would turn into the most gruesome war ever fought to that point in time. It was a genuine tragedy and a failure of leadership.
As a military historian, I just want to say that war is the worst thing that ever happens to humanity. Everything in society is subservient or secondary to war when war comes along. Out of war comes some of the worst that humans and people can do to each other. United States, having a buffer, its own moat of 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, were isolationists. They didn't want anything to do with this genocide that's occurring in Europe. And they were successful for 3 years.
A war of firsts, the Great War, the war to end all wars.
There never been a war like World War I until 1914.
Warfare, its conduct, had never before seen the kind of armaments that World War I introduced to the battlefield. Things like the machine gun, tanks, airplanes, aircraft carriers, chemical warfare, even how to respond to that. It took a terrible toll, not only physically with the mass casualties that such weapons could produce, but also psychologically. None of this had ever been experienced in warfare.
It's a paradox of war, which brings out the worst in humans, often leads to some of the most beneficial discoveries. Aviation was seriously launched by World War I. It started, of course, with the flight of the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But the airplanes that we see today really were a result of the demands of war.
Now, in 1915, the Germans decided to use their greatest tool in their naval arsenal, which was the U-boat, the submarines, the Unterboot, to ravage the seas in the North Atlantic, to take on and destroy or capture neutral shipping that was bringing food, armaments, other things from other countries, mostly the United States, to France or England.
Initially, Joseph Smith was not for the war, but as more evidence came in and the situation changed, he changed his train of thought and felt that we should support the war effort to preserve freedom.
All of the wars that have been fought on this earth in our mortal existence are really aspects of the war that was fought in heaven. And the principal issue for which the war in heaven was fought, and all of the wars in mortality and one where the other were fought, is this foundational issue of agency.
So one of the motivating causes of World War I was the pitting of empires who used monarchy to govern the people, as opposed to France, which was a democracy, England, which was a constitutional monarchy. World War I was really fought over, we want more ground because we want to expand our type of government and our view of the world. As the war wore on, and it became very clear that this was a struggle for the very existence of Europe, it became a battle for freedom. That's what drew America into the war.
Alma chapter 61, verses 13 and 14. But behold, he doth not command us that we shall subject ourselves to our enemies, but that we should put our trust in him and he will deliver us. Therefore, my beloved brother Moroni, let us resist evil, and whatsoever evil we cannot resist with our words, yea, such as rebellions and dissensions, let us resist them with our swords, that we may retain our freedom, that we may rejoice in the great privilege of our church and in the cause of our Redeemer and our God.
They were raised to defend their faith and defend their freedom. They did not take it lightly. As I consider my grandchildren and another generation growing up in relative peace in the world, I wonder how much they really know and understand about the courage and the faith of those people. What is in their hearts about them? How much do they know about the people? How much do they know about the situation? How much do they know about their history?
The United States declared its neutrality actually on 4th of August 1914, and during the next 3 years endured a series of challenges to that American position. These included the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, the sinking of the Sussex in 1916, Germany's declaration in January 1917 regarding unrestricted warfare on the open seas, which was followed shortly by the sinking of the Laconia and 3 American steamships, and the Zimmermann telegram.
A German ambassador wrote a very poorly thought out telegram called the Zimmermann telegram, in which he encouraged Mexico to come to war against the United States, to join Germany in that cause, promising to give them the territories of Arizona, New Mexico, parts of California when they were victorious. Well, this outraged American opinion, and it was really a proximate cause of us finally deciding to go into the war.
American neutrality ended on April 6, 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany.
Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boy's in line. Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
About 2.2 million American soldiers arrived or were in France and were in the fight. But it was a huge logistical thing too, where we had to take our own locomotives and we had to build our own railroads in France for supplies and services, because the French gauge tracks were different than our U.S. locomotives. So we had to lay hundreds of miles of rail there in France to supply the effort.
As best we can tell, the number of Latter-day Saints who served in the war, probably in the neighborhood of 22 or 3,000. Most of them came from the Intermountain West and in the United States. Still, hundreds served even in the German forces. So the Great War was really the first war in which substantial numbers of Latter-day Saints served on both sides of a conflict. And that introduced some interesting dynamics.
President Joseph F. Smith, the 6th President of the Church, expressed a very interesting thought at the time of World War I, and especially addressing the soldiers. He told them, "I exhort my friends to maintain above all other things the spirit of humanity, of love and of peacemaking, that even though they may be called into action, they will not demolish, override, and destroy the principles which we believe in, which we have tried to inculcate, and which we are exhorted to maintain, peace and goodwill toward all mankind, that we may be brought into action with the enemy." I want to say to Latter-day Saints who may enlist and whose services the country may require, that when they become soldiers of the state and of the nation, that they will not forget that they are also soldiers of the cross, that they are ministers of life and not of death, and when they go forth, they may go forth in the spirit of defending the liberties of mankind rather than for the purpose of destroying the enemy.
But when the call to action came, we know that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints felt that call and volunteered.
The United States was motivated by the idea of bringing freedom to Europe and standing up for liberty. So you saw all sorts of campaigns that promoted the cause of liberty.
Joseph F. Smith had 6 sons that he sent off to war. He chose my grandfather Calvin to be one of 3 chaplains, LDS servicemen selected as chaplains. There was Calvin S. Smith, Herbert Ma, who later became the governor, and B.H. Roberts, who was the general authority. Of those 3, Calvin was the only one to see significant battle, and he was in some of the bloodiest battles in U.S. military history. He was right in the middle of them, unarmed as a chaplain.
One of the interesting personalities in church leadership during the early 20th century was a man by the name of B.H. or Brigham H. Roberts. He was a member of the Council of the 70. He was church historian for an important period of time, served as a mission president. He loved his country, and when the Great War broke out, he determined that he wanted to serve in active service, even as a chaplain at the age of 60 years old. There were obstacles to his service, but he wanted nonetheless to pass the physical examination portion and be found qualified, and he did. He served with distinction. He loved those that he was assigned to work with.
Of the 3 LDS chaplains, Chaplain Roberts does not see any active fighting during the war. His unit arrives in France. They're one of the later units to deploy. They go into a training period, and by the time they're preparing to deploy to the front, the armistice is signed. Chaplain Ma, his unit does see some conflict, but not nearly as much as Chaplain Smith.
What made it unique for Calvin is he had served a mission in Germany and had learned to love the people, which created quite an interesting dynamic to be going over there and fighting them.
His German came in handy throughout the war. As prisoners would be captured on the front, he would see these young, scared German kids, and he would go up and be able to speak with them in fluent, colloquial German and put their minds at ease and let them know that everything was going to be okay and that for them the war was over.
My grandfather, Henry Marcin Hamblin, served as a soldier in World War I. When he arrived in France, he, as a sergeant in the United States Army, was assigned to train soldiers and transport them to the front. This week, we had our son, who was a similar build and height to my grandfather, try on that jacket. And it was fun to think about Grandpa being that age and having the experiences he had. Part of his military experience involved athletics. To keep up the morale of the troops, they often had what we would term Olympics or military Olympics and contests. He got first place on the 4th of July for his long jump. He has a gold medal for the high jump. I'm grateful for this wonderful man and the many hundreds of thousands like him who understood the purpose of preserving our freedoms.
I have a very personal connection to World War I in that my own father actually fought in World War I. I was born later in his life and was raised on stories about his experiences in the United States Marine Corps during World War I and during World War II. And so I do believe that there are lessons to be learned, important lessons to be learned, as we reflect on the nature of war and warfare, and also reflect on the sacrifices that were made by our brothers and sisters in arms in these great conflicts. We are here in Belleau Wood, the actual site where the United States Marine Corps 5th Regiment, 4th Marine Brigade defended these woods against the German offensive beginning in June of 1918. And we see all around us examples of the armaments that were used by the Marine Corps in defense of this area, preventing the German offensive from pressing forward to capture the great city of Paris. This was a desperate battle where the stakes were life and death. My father, who actually fought on the very ground that we're now walking, described some of the desperate situations in which the Marines found themselves. Because the ground was rocky, the Marines, when they arrived and began to dig in on June the 2nd, 1918, were not able to dig trenches, and so the best that they could do before the Germans attacked was to scoop out areas of dirt so that they could fight from the prone position. Of course, the French knew that the Germans were coming, and so as the Marines arrived, they saw a number of French troops heading back behind the lines. The French encouraged these fool Marines to do likewise. When one of the French majors asked to talk to the Marine Corps commander, a captain by the name of Lloyd Williams, he encouraged the Marines to leave the area. And this then gave rise to the very famous story about Captain Williams saying those words, quote, "Retreat hell, we just got here," unquote. And of course, being raised in a home where profanity was frowned upon, as my father told this story, it made a deep impression on me because we didn't use that kind of language very often. Just a few days later, the world, so to speak, fell in on top of the Marines, and they were engaged in a desperate battle. The Marines fought with such valor that they were recognized by the French government, the French people, for their defense of Belleau Wood, a battle that lasted from the 5th of June to the 26th of June, 1918.
The sisters participate in many efforts combined with the Red Cross and other organizations throughout the world, but they also did things on the home front.
Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning.
I am amazed by how many of the nurses in Utah volunteered to serve in the war. We had Latter-day Saint sisters who organized knitting groups. These things happened all over the world. The United States bought 200,000 bushels of wheat from the Relief Society. Their sacrifice and savings helped preserve many lives. The Sisters of the Church gave substantial support during World War I. They were always seeking for inspiration of how best to help. They wrote so many wonderful letters of support. Messages took a long time to arrive and to be responded to, but every message was precious, and every effort by the sisters was heartfelt.
Letters from those back home meant a great deal to the soldier away to war. To be reminded of those back home, praying for them who were on the front battle lines. And it must have surely meant a great deal to them.
Till the boys come home.
President Joseph F. Smith, the sixth president of the church, said that while there were many wonderful organizations in the world that blessed the people, they are man-made or women-made. He said the Relief Society is divinely made, divinely authorized, divinely instituted, divinely ordained of God to minister for the salvation of the souls of women and men. I find it very moving that during this time of conflict, the leaders of the church were helping the members to focus on charity and love for one another all around the world. And there was another great focus on the motto of Relief Society, Charity Never Faileth. It was renewed in purpose during the time of World War I.
One of the interesting things about aviation in World War I is the role the women played back here in the United States. Aircraft of World War I usually consisted of wooden wings that were covered in fabric that were then varnished to give them their appearance. You had to keep an aircraft light. The ratio of engine power to weight was crucial, and women had experience with both being seamstresses in working with the very fine tools that are required to make the intricate wooden pieces that would support these airplanes. And so they were able to contribute directly to the success of the American soldiers, particularly the aviators, in this role of production back in the United States.
When things got tough, you kind of thought about Grandpa Humphrey. He was in World War I. All of a sudden, this heavy shell fire started happening all around him. It just kind of hits the deck, and they started smelling gas. And they thought, I think there's gas here. The Germans would send gas over in shells. And so they put their gas mask on, but it was too late. They'd already been, their eyes started to sting. Once he got to the hospital, he spent about a month there during heavy fighting. He eventually went back, but because of the time he spent there, he said a lot of his 1st Division were killed. So that might have been a blessing in disguise. Just the confidence he had in himself and the bravery, I think was a great example for all of his kids and his grandkids.
One of my dad's best friends was an Army World War I officer, and he regaled me with all kind of stories about us kids when he served in the military. He said he had a good experience. He was sent to Europe, but he survived, and he was the main World War I veteran that I knew well. But he had no regrets. He said that we did what we had to do to keep freedom going, and then Hitler came along and messed it all up again.
A small number, and a very small number, served in the Navy from Utah, but one of the contributions from Utah was the fact that the USS Utah, a battleship, by the way, this is the same USS Utah that would be sunk on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. But the ship, it was built in 1909. This is a keepsake from that period. It's a silk bag, basically, where young men could put letters and keepsakes of their own to give it to their sweetheart or wife in remembrance. And it's got the USS Utah here as just a reminder. This ship saw service during the First World War. It was stationed mostly off the coast of Ireland and served to protect the seaways there. On the 26th of September, 1918, Chaplain Calvin Smith had a very unusual experience. He was invited to go as part of an intelligence reconnaissance up toward German lines. They snuck up across behind the initial German lines, and as they crept within earshot of the Germans, they came under fire from German snipers.
So he got down into a prone position facing the sniper and then got his helmet in the way.
And he said bullets were whizzing over his head the entire time. Crawled back very slowly back to the American lines.
And he went to eat his dinner.
He took a can of beef out of his knapsack.
Opened a can of bully beef, which is corned beef hash.
Poured the contents into his mess kit, heated it up, started eating.
And bit down on a bullet. The sniper had shot through his backpack and it lodged into a can of corned beef.
And he said, I almost broke my teeth.
So a can of corned beef saved Calvin S. Smith's life. Now, oddly enough, the rest of his life, he loved corned beef, hash, and potatoes for breakfast. He developed a love of that because of the war that just never died. He became very fond of corned beef.
So Thomas Nyber enlists. This farm boy from Sugar City, Idaho, goes overseas at the age of 18. On the 16th of October at Côte-de-Châtillon in the 42nd Division, whose brigade, the 84th Brigade, was commanded by a guy named Douglas MacArthur. Thomas Nyber, once his loader and his spotter was killed, fought himself single-handedly. About 45 or 55 Germans attacked him on that day. He captured 11 and killed and wounded all the rest. Amazing feat. Was awarded the Medal of Honor by Pershing himself. He was wounded 4 times. One bullet entered into his bowels, somehow lodged against his spine. He lived through it and was never removed.
I'm here today in beautiful Memory Grove Park in Salt Lake City, Utah. This park, built in the early 1920s, is dedicated to the memory of those who have paid the ultimate price in wartime. It was begun with a focus on those of World War I's generation. Of course, many of those who served did not return home, and their names are inscribed on this beautiful bronze relief. 665 by number. We remember in places like this the high price of freedom. Most of those who come to contemplate and remember those who died in service never experienced the environment of war. We don't know the violence that attends fighting, but we can be united in paying tribute to the sacrifice and service they rendered. I consider it a great privilege that much of my professional career has been devoted to the purpose of understanding their lives and stories, to understanding their families and the sacrifices made. Of course, any time a nation sends its youth to war, there are complex questions that need to be asked and answered. Regardless of the tensions of a particular conflict and the political and other considerations that will be debated, we can all be united in expressing adoration for those who went, who answered their nation's call, and who sacrificed so much for us.
Arms! Present! Arms!
We are here today in the N. Marne Cemetery, about 50 miles east of Paris, France. And this cemetery contains the remains of 2,289 American soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice for the cause of freedom and liberty and to prevent a dictatorship from assuming control of Europe. And this hallowed ground is sacred. It is made sacred by the sacrifices and the blood of those who fought to redeem the land. There are 1,066 names listed on the walls of this chapel. Men who died, who are still missing. 1,066 brave sons of our Father in heaven, whose lives were cut short as a result of their willingness to sacrifice for a cause greater than themselves. We're talking about individuals who had hopes and dreams, most of whom were fairly young, who had most of their living years ahead of them, whose lives were taken. Because my future has been redeemed or purchased with such a dear price, and that is the meaning of the word redeem, to purchase. Because my future has been purchased at such a dear price, I think those who made the sacrifice have a right to ask, what are you doing with your future? What are you doing with those opportunities that were paid for and purchased by the shedding of our blood? What decisions are you making that will help others to be better and to do better? That is, I think, an aspect of the doctrine and concept of gratitude that we need to pay more attention to as we're in the midst of those who purchased or redeemed our future, redeemed our land, redeemed our eternities by the shedding of blood. So we do owe something to those that have gone before, and I'm profoundly cognizant of that.
When I think of those who paid the ultimate price in the Great War, I can't help but think of individuals such as an ancestor of mine named Charles Flake. He hailed from Snowflake, Arizona. As a youth, he served his church as a full-time missionary, and upon his return undertook studies in pharmaceutical major at USC, the University of Southern California. Soon after, he received a draft notice. He would return to Snowflake just long enough to marry his sweetheart Ruth, and then off to war. He actually volunteered to serve in Siberia, a reminder that the war was not only fought in the battlefields of France, but in very diverse places. He served throughout the remainder of the war. The armistice came in November of 1918. They began to wonder if the nation they called home would ever reclaim them. In June of 1919, he was ambushed by locals in a village and killed, and never returned back home to his beloved sweetheart and to their newly born daughter. The toll of war is high, and he and countless others paid that ultimate price.
I am standing in front of the Chateau Thierry American Monument, which commemorates the efforts of the United States Armed Forces in this region. This monument was dedicated in 1937, as was the cemetery at Belleau Wood.
It is for me a distinct pleasure to see before me on this former battlefield so many veterans who served here and elsewhere with the American Army in the World War. Here, the final advance of the enemy toward Paris, late in May 1918, was stopped by the 2nd and 3rd American Division. This memorial testifies to our faith that we to whom they passed their torch can uphold and will maintain the principles for which these men died. Time will not dim the glory of their deeds.
This important monument is commemorative of the efforts of all of those who fought in defense of freedom and the promotion of liberty to promote causes that are greater than any one nation. That's what we're looking at here in this beautiful monument.
Because of the war and soldiers moving back and forth, the flu virus was transported around the world.
But if you look at the nature of the global pandemic in 1918 through 1920, you get on the low end a statistic of 20 million fatalities, and then on the high end 100 million fatalities. So even if we split the difference and go with somewhere between 40 to 60 million fatalities, that is an amazing mortality rate that ravaged the world in those 2 or 3 years.
1918 is the time when, as the guns will become silent, the flu will become the new killing factor.
More died from the flu and its attendant impact than even as casualties of the direct war. It was one of the great pandemics in history. So as a extension of the sadness and the just devastation to families and all that impact had, the flu was a terrible thing.
World War I had been so destructive and so devastating, affecting not only combatants but the innocents in different countries around the world who had lost most of the resources that could have been used to combat the influenza in 1918. Most of the medical personnel in the United States in 1918 had actually been gobbled up by the military to try to assist in the war effort. Resistance, just physiological resistance of people, was perhaps at an all-time low because of the devastation of World War I.
In the Surin American War Cemetery that is behind me, you see these crosses, white crosses, for those 1,500 and more American soldiers that are buried here. One of them is Stanford Hinckley. He is the oldest brother of Gordon B. Hinckley, former president of the church. Stanford Hinckley will never reach the battlefield.
Stanford died just weeks before the end of the war, but of the flu, not of fighting. The family did not receive word until well after the conclusion of the fighting.
The Great War, 1914-1918, is the cause, basically, of World War II. It is a fundamental cause.
Once a nation commits to something as serious as total unrestricted warfare, which is what happened in World War I, you don't know what the consequences are. The Tsar of Russia was overthrown by Lenin because the Russian people had grown weary of the cost of war. That had led to the domination of the Soviet Union by the communists. Who can say if communism would have established itself in China had it not first established itself in the Soviet Union? Ancient monarchies were destroyed by World War I, replaced by democracies, and in some places were very successful. In Germany, however, we essentially said, you now need to be a democracy. We imposed that on them. They created the Weimar Republic, and then the Allies walked away, wasted by the cost of the war and wanting to heal their wounds. The Germans simply didn't know how to manage a democracy, and so it became possible for Adolf Hitler to use the ballot box to establish his control in Germany, and then, of course, to do away with the ballot box. He became a tyrannical dictator. That's what happened in Italy and other places. So as nations consider the cost of war, you don't know what the outcome is going to be, including all the unintended outcomes of war. I think that's one of the sobering lessons that we get from World War I.
If you would have asked my father and the thousands of others that served as brothers in arms in combat situations, I think that they would say they were just regular people trying to do what they thought was the right thing to do. And yet, I think we see some genuine heroes. You could argue that, well, it was the circumstances that made the heroes, but I would argue that it was the heroes that made the circumstances.
Calvin was injured twice. He received 2 Purple Hearts and then 1 shrapnel wound. 1 bullet he carried his whole life. Very rare for a chaplain to be involved in that type of action, but he felt it was his duty to serve his fellow men, and his whole life was that way. In 1947, he formed a coalition of other leaders in the state, and they pushed through the legislation that made the Utah Technical College possible, which is now Salt Lake Community College. So he was the driving force, Calvin was, for Salt Lake Community College. What I remember is going into the living room and looking into his office, and he would be reading. He was just a scholar, just brilliant man. And he had this office just full of books. And then he would have another bedroom full of books. And so when he got the Salt Lake County Library bond passed, they named one of the Salt Lake County libraries after Calvin S. Smith Library. And also they've named an elementary school after him, the Calvin S. Smith Elementary. Much of the initial books were from my grandpa's library. He would read about 4 hours a day. And just a very brilliant man.
This French 75 artillery shell casing has been worked into a vase with a rose motif on it, and someone has taken their time to tap it, and it makes for a nice little vase to then put your silk poppies into so that you can remember the war, the sacrifices that so many men made. The poppy was immortalized in John McCrae's famous poem, In Flanders Fields, where he says, in Flanders fields the poppies grow between the crosses row on row that mark our place.
His courage on the battlefield, lasted throughout his whole life, and his example for all of his kids and grandkids that Grandpa was so strong and so brave and had so much courage that we wanted to be like that.
As Relief Society General President, I visited many families and many soldiers, men and women, who served in the United States military. I had such a love for them. We have sisters of our Relief Society who put on the uniforms of the United States of America and other nations to defend freedoms. I love them for their sacrifices and for their diligent desires to preserve freedoms. I hope we never lose that spirit. I hope it never becomes commonplace. I hope we maintain the feeling of love for those who defend us.
We understand that in the future things are going to get dicey, things are going to get worse. There's going to be more armed conflict, not less. But I think from past experience, we know that we can turn to the Lord and that He will support us, and that He will help us to navigate the tight spots that we must go through in order to eventually enjoy the presence of the Prince of Peace.
God is real, He's alive and cares for us. And if we do our part, take a step forward, that the good things happen, not only individually, but as a family. And not only as a family, but as a nation.
As I look upon this monument, I can't help but think of the lives represented in this relief. Those who sacrifice so much for the freedoms that I enjoy. In some sense, my life and my devotion to God and country is the greatest gift I can give back in appreciation for that service, for that sacrifice.
I would hope that we take those lessons into our lives and not just pass over this, because that event influences who we are today. I hope that we build on that faith and that sense of freedom.
Truly, we owe so much to so many people who went before. When we do not look afar backwards in time and harden our hearts to the sacrifices and the activities of those who went before us, we're not honoring, as we should, those who gave their last full measure of devotion so that we could have our tomorrows. There are a number of life's lessons that come directly from remembering what it is that our fathers, our forefathers have done for us. We look back, we gain a perspective, an eternal perspective that can't be gained unless we come to appreciate what happened here 100 years ago during the First World War. I really do hope that one of the things that viewers will take from this film is the idea that there is always reason for hope, and that out of any seeming catastrophe, there are reasons to look to the future and resolve to make the world better for the rising generations. And we don't have to wallow in pity, but we can take what happened in the past, learn from it, and create a bright future. As I look at our situation today, the circumstances that we're all living in, it seems to me that there is reason for hope, that we're not just coming out of a devastating war where most of our resources have been affected, if not completely destroyed. Most of us are living in relative peace, in some measure of happiness, with medical facilities at our beck and call, at our fingertips, which was not the case at the end of World War I. And so I think that there's reason for hope that our science has gotten better, that people have gotten smarter and understand that warfare, no matter the reason, is devastating, and it's usually the non-combatants who suffer the most, women and children who are arguably the most innocent. We don't live in those circumstances today. And the circumstances that we do live in, I think, demonstrate an amazing example of how God's hand is over His children.
I remember the argument. "I don't have a story to tell," Dad said. 88 years old, and I've done nothing special. I begged, he balked. I bribed, he finally relented. He told me about living through the Depression, the war, the few hearts he'd broken along the way, and how he chased Mom to China to get her to marry him. I found out that he went to jail for a friend. Who does that? And that the hardest times of his life were when Mom lost the twins, the day I wrecked the car, and of course Mom's cancer. He told me the night Mom died, he stared long and hard at a bottle of pills, wanting to, but instead he curled up and cried at the foot of my bed. I was 12. I had no idea. I buried Dad today. The flag they placed in my arms at his graveside and the book of his memories are suddenly the most precious things I own.
Your life is a great library of stories. It would be an honor for us at FamilyHeritagePublishers.com to help you preserve them. Learn more at FamilyHeritagePublishers.com.